Yes, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to your number one and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel, where we continue to take a look at more of those old school vintage dirt bikes from way back in the day. Now, as we head towards the end of another classic and vintage racing season throughout the winter months, of course, we will be bringing you more of these old school vintage race bikes. So if you haven't already subscribed to CDB TV, then now would be a very good time to do that, because we do have some very nice bikes and interesting projects for you to take a look at through the coming winter months. So if you haven't already subscribed, then I do hope you will do that very small thing. So coming up next, we're going to take a look at another bike that I spotted in the paddock as I was at the recent Northern Ireland Classic charity event in the summer of 2022. Now, this bike here is not a fully original bike, but nonetheless it's certainly worth a look here on CDB TV. So let's jump straight into the video and take a look at Matt Halpin's 1980 MX6 Can-Am 400. Okay, so this was another one of the bikes that I captured at the Northern Ireland Charity Scramble in 2022, and this 400 Can-Am qualifier belongs to Matt Halpin, and this was one of two very nice bikes that Matt had brought along on the day, with his other bike being a quite nice Italian-made SWM. But I'm sure you already know that these Can-Ams were all built by the Canadian Bombardier company, who were more well known for building their 4x4 utility quad bikes and other machines like snowmobiles. And Bombardier have certainly been in business since Joseph Armand Bombardier formed the company way back in 1937. Although it wasn't until around the 1970s that Bombardier actually got into manufacturing motorcycles, and rather than compete with the might of the big four Japanese companies who were churning out road-going motorcycles by their millions, Bombardier decided to focus on the much smaller niche market of off-road competition bikes. And to be fair, in the forthcoming years, they did build some very competitive race machines. And so as we get to our featured Can-Am, which is a 1980 400 qualifier MX6B, and naturally Matt's bike here isn't a fully stock original bike from that year, because it does have a few non-original parts bolted onto it, but despite that, it's still a very good example of what was a pretty decent Twinshock racer from the early 1980s. Now, Matt did tell me that he bought the nucleus of this bike as just a frame and a swing arm, because he already had a spare set of Can-Am wheels and engine lying around in his workshop, and he then purchased a set of Marzocchi forks from a local internet auction site to basically give him a good starting point to finish building what was going to end up as a spare or second race bike. But by the time that Matt finished putting it all together, he said he liked the bike so much it's now his number one go-to motorcycle. And although Matt's creation here is still not 100% correct 400 from 1980, it's still a very good rendition of one of these quite rapid Can-Am Twinshockers. Now again, I'm pretty sure you don't need me to tell you that these Can-Am race bikes were powered by a 400cc two-stroke Rotax engine, and this motor here was hugely successful during the late 1970s and early 80s, that it was used on a multitude of different makes and models of off-road bike during that period. And although the motor still had Bombardier on the engine casings, these were still all supplied by the Austrian Rotax manufacturer. Now these motors, of course, would have originally been painted in that same orange colour as the bike's frame, but as I said, this is a spare engine that Matt had lying around his workshop that he used to put into this Can-Am frame, which has probably been rebuilt quite a few times in its life and has now lost much of its original orange patina over the years. But basically this was still a strong, powerful engine that was very quick and very reliable, and quite light as well, as I remember, in terms of its overall weight. But it did have a 5-speed gearbox and the usual wet multi-plate clutch. Now this particular engine's clutch cover isn't of course the original stock 400 casing, as this particular casing has been taken from an ATK 406, which Matt says makes the clutch pull much lighter because the 406 actuator is slightly different and it works much better than the stock 400 item. Now once again the motor's exhaust expansion chamber is not the original 400 pipe from 1980, but this pipe once again has been taken from an ATK 406 motor, which Matt says makes the power delivery much smoother on this engine than the stock original pipe. Now this again has been appeared to have been chromed at one time, maybe just to add a bit of bling, whereas the stock 400 pipe that would have been fitted in 1980 would more than likely have just been painted in matte black. Although I also expect that this tailpipe isn't the original item from 1980, but will probably still do its job efficiently enough to work with that 400 motor and that ATK exhaust header pipe. But as I said earlier, these Marzocchi front forks appear to be correct for our 1980 400, and these are the suspension units that Matt managed to source from that internet auction site when he was putting this bike together. And again, as far as these old suspension systems are concerned, these Marzocchis were pretty good for their day. Now once again, our 1980 Can-Ams were fitted with these old school drum brakes, which I suppose did their job sufficiently considering the era and the technology of the day. And as I remember, these had magnesium backplates as well, which was just to further try and reduce the all-up weight of this motorcycle, which I think was around the 230 pound mark back in 1980. Now once more, at the back end of one of these Can-Ams in that year, it would have more than likely been a pair of Olin shocks or maybe S&W suspension units that would have been bolted onto the back of this bike. But after 42 years of track use under its wheels, it's certainly no surprise that those older original units have now long gone on our Can-Am, and a pair of modern style YSS rear shocks are now bolted in their place. And these YSS suspension units also have these remote gas reservoirs bolted onto the outside of the chassis, which did allow you a little scope for some kind of adjustment and other fine tuning. Although without doubt these YSS suspension units are very good quality and well suited to this old school Twinshock racer. Now, because our particular Can-Am 400 here is the MX6B model, it came with this brand new alloy swing arm, which was an upgrade to the earlier steel swing arms that were used on some of the older models. But this alloy swing arm, although much lighter than the stock steel items, it could certainly be a bit prone to cracking if the rider was hard on the bike, especially if the track was very bumpy or that the rider liked his airtime with very hard landings. Now, naturally, a plastic fuel tank for a 1980 motocrosser, as this was around the time that almost all of the off-road bike manufacturers were now beginning to change from the more expensive steel or alloy fuel tanks to these plastic varieties, mostly because they were lighter, they were cheaper to produce, and of course there was no concerns with regards rusting or corrosion that you often found on the steel or alloy fuel cells. And once more, a decent seat was fitted to the 1980 Can-Am, and there was just about enough padding in this motorcycle seat to give your backside a bit of a rest between those rough bits on the track. But this seat foam and its cover all came direct from DC Plastics in the USA. As Matt said, that the bike's original parts were all well past their sell-by date, and of course no use at all on this new rebuilt machine. Now, once again, these hand guards that are fitted onto Matt's bike aren't original fixtures from that year, but they're still a very good addition to stop some of those big stones battering your knuckles if you're riding on a particularly stony racetrack. Now, the bike's front and rear mudguards were among some of the parts that Matt had already languishing around in his workshop, so these once again were then used to more or less complete the build of Matt's new machine. Of course, not the correct colour for a 1980 400, as these should be orange, the same colour as the tank and the frame. But at the end of the day, this bike was built to race and not as an original restoration or show bike. But Matt's little Can-Am MX6 is never going to win the most original or best looking bike at the next off-road bike show or concourse motorcycle event, because it is neither original or shiny enough to compete in such an event. But then again, it was never meant to be, because Matt already has another MX6 in his workshop, and this particular bike build project all really came about because Matt wanted a spare or backup machine when he went to the races, and it just so happens that when it was finished, that it turned out to be a much better machine than his normal number one bike, that he then opted to use this one instead. Although over the 2 days of this charity scramble in Northern Ireland, Matt certainly enjoyed himself on his MX6 while he was riding in one of the Twinshock classes, because to be fair, these Bombardier Can-Ams were still very quick bikes on the track back in the 1980s, although you certainly don't see as many of them now taking part in these kind of vintage or classic race events. But original or not, I think it's still good to take a look at one of these iconic machines, and it's great that the likes of Matt isn't too much bothered about originality, but more importantly, he's built a bike for the reason that it was first intended, and that was to ride it on a motocross track. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around Matt Halpin's 1980 400 Can-Am. As I said, not a fully original bike, of course, but certainly a very nice weekend race bike. So coming up in my next video posting, we're going to show you a few very nice bold tacos that I came across while I was attending the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and this few bull tacos that you see here were just one or two of the bikes that were sitting on the Bultaco stand over the course of the weekend. So in my next video posting, we'll be taking a look at these very nice examples of that Spanish Bultaco mark. But until then, of course, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well, and watch out what you're doing when you're riding those old vintage dirt bikes. And I hope to see you back here again very soon so we can talk about more of these old vintage race bikes right here on your #1 and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.